They are the artists who put the pop in American pop. Marvin Gaye, The Platters, Van Morrison, Tom Jones, the Everly Brothers, Ray Charles, Dionne Warwick, Jose Feliciano, Willie Nelson, James Brown. This is the series that goes backstage and tells the stories of those who entered the recording studio and created gold. This is Music Legends, and you've got a seat at front and center.
Ray Charles is not one of those marginal artists. If you're making a list of the greatest people, he's on it. It's not an overstatement at all to say that Ray Charles is a national treasure.
Ray Charles defies description. You can't really put him in any sort of category. He just sort of is his own category.
Ray started out from nowhere. He had talent, and that's absolutely all he needed.
He is an international phenomenon. He was when he broke out, and he still is today.
Well, now he's known everywhere. There's probably not a place on earth where they don't know Ray Charles.
He had global fame, but he also had global respect. In Russia, they know it's cool to listen to Ray Charles. Hundreds, if not thousands of writers have told and retold his story.
It's especially the kind of story that Americans like to hear.
Ray Charles is a really good example of what symbolizes the best in all of us.
He represents a way of life that everybody in music can admire.
He bridges the gap between obscure pioneers and the eternal famous stars.
Ray Charles is a pioneer similar to Sam Cooke. I mean, if you think about the way that they're both sort of innovators.
Jackie Wilson is another name that you have to associate with Ray Charles.
He's as identifiable as Elvis, easily. And maybe apples and oranges to some, but to me, they're the same. He's up there with James Brown, but he's as diverse as guys like Fats Waller and Hank Williams.
His life story is filled with paradox. You can't say he's controversial, but you can say he's filled with contradictions.
He's a lot more complex than most of his fans know. He's not just this cuddly songbird, he's a man of multiple textures. It shouldn't be surprising at all that this story has so many different levels to it, because that's the way the American dream is.
He has sort of a rags to riches life. I mean, you can't go through what he's gone through and not know a lot about a lot.
There's no doubt about it. A lot of his life is about overcoming tragedy.
You couldn't make up his story. I mean, it's just too perfect in its design.
It's light transcending darkness.
Hollywood Boulevard's Walk of Fame has a star honoring Ray Charles. That's a no-brainer.
There's a bronze bust of Ray Charles, of course, in the Playboy Jazz Hall of Fame.
By now, he has every award you can imagine. Ray Charles is an award-collecting machine.
He's probably won the Playboy Jazz Hall of Fame every year that they've had it. In fact, he's probably in every Jazz Hall of Fame that there is.
Ray Charles has a bronze medallion from the French Republic.
There's many French Hall of Fame for music, but you know, he's been in all of them.
Ray Charles has quite a few humanitarian awards as well. I mean, he became a real political leader in the 60s.
Jazz artists consider him to be a member of their club, even when he strays off and does other forms of music.
The world of rhythm and blues owes a lot to Ray Charles. I mean, he made that sort of music more mainstream. He brought it out.
He can play many genres and many styles, because no matter what he does, it becomes uniquely a Ray Charles piece.
You can find a lot of rock and roll that incorporates the sound of Ray Charles.
It's pretty safe to say that he has about every award that you can find in the recording industry. He has Grammys for a number of projects, singles and albums as well.
A long time ago, he said that he's been really lucky being able to deal with blackness and blindness. You have to go back to where he started from to really know how far a person can come.
It's been written a billion times. He came from extreme poverty, but we are talking extreme poverty.
It's safe to say that his story makes it impossible for anyone else to complain about his or her life.
If you were born in the segregated South, you saw a completely different world than we see today.
Still, all things considered, he was one very lucky man to have been born with that kind of talent.
In those days, music was the only force that could take a poor black blind child from there to here.
He had a good phrase for it. He said, "I was born with music inside me. That's the only explanation I know."
He says that even in those hazy days of his youth, he knew exactly who he was.
I read a quote where he said that music was part of his makeup, like his parts, like his blood. It's within him.
When Ray Charles says music is in his blood, he's not bragging or exaggerating in any way, shape, or form. It's really the truth. Actually, music was a force on Ray Charles when he first arrived on the planet.
Music is a necessity for someone like Ray Charles. It's not like he has a choice about it.
He told one writer that music was nothing less than food and water to him.
He's one of those creatures that embodies talent with every ounce of his being.
Ray Charles once said, "Music is nothing separate from me, it is me."
His real name is Ray Robinson. Middle name is Charles. Ray Charles Robinson.
When people ask him if he was born blind, he says, "Oh no, just poor."
Most people think that he was born blind, but he was born with his sight intact.
It's hard to know whether it's worse to lose something you never had or to miss something you never knew existed.
His family had no money whatsoever. And I'm talking no money. None. Zip. Zero. Zilch.
He was born in the absolute middle of nowhere. It was a little town in the outskirts of Albany, Georgia.
Ray Charles Robinson was the first child of Aretha and Bailey Robinson.
It was a very tough time for everybody. It was a tough time for America.
The whole country was limping along that year he was born, 1930, September 23rd. Having nothing where they were in Georgia, his family picked up and moved when he was only 3 months old.
They didn't move all that far. They moved across a state line to Greenville, Florida.
It was during the Depression that he was born, so if you know how bad things were for other people, you can just imagine what it must have been like for his family.
He talks about the economic ladder of his life, and he was at the bottom of that ladder. Ray Charles joked one time that ground was the only thing lower than the poverty level that they were living in.
He did get to see a few things back in those years, back when he still had his vision. He had almost 7 years of good sight memory before everything went bad.
He started going blind when he was 4, but he could still see for another 3 years. How sad for this child who knew he was losing his sight year by year, and there was nothing he could do about it.
So as the years went on, things grew dimmer for him. And by the time he was 7, he was blind. It was glaucoma that took his sight away, and that wasn't all that rare back then because there wasn't any real testing for that in those days.
In those years when his eyesight was beginning to be just about gone, he would stare at the brightest objects he could find because that's about all he could see. I'm sure it wasn't good for the condition that he had, but he used to love to look up at the sun when he could.
He wrote one time that he remembers seeing lightning in the sky. And that was before, or right about the time that he was starting to lose his vision. Those bright things were the last things that he saw, but he can still remember them vividly to this day.
When he was 6 years old, he would strike matches to see if he could still make out the shape of the flame.
Ray Charles told a biographer he still remembers seeing trees and bits of nature around his house.
Even to this day, he still remembers certain colors that he saw when he was a child.
He grew up in the backwoods country, and he made very vivid mental notes of those images.
Ray Charles was fortunate enough to have seen the face of the most important person in his life, his mother. Luckily for the family, there was a school nearby to help him once he lost all of his sight.
St. Augustine was a very good school for the blind, and his mother was smart enough to get him there. The Robinson family didn't have very much money, so he was accepted as a kind of a charity student.
Ray was lucky to find a place that would educate him with his special needs. I mean, it's not like his family could pay for it. He learned how to read Braille shortly after he started at St. Augustine.
But it was more than simply teaching Braille at that school. They tried to give all kinds of skills to the blind.
Early on, it was obvious that he had these gifts for both singing and for being a pianist.
Of course, it wouldn't have mattered where he was at the time, but that's when he developed his great gift of music.
Musically, he advanced when he discovered that math was a part of his curriculum, a part that he could master.
Very early on, at a young age, he could count math's connection to music.
Thanks to math, he learned how to compose and arrange musical numbers in his head.
It wasn't long before that school became his real home. He was a very good student and he was curious about everything.
Even though he had no formal music training, he taught himself how to break down the music and actually compose.
He stayed at St. Augustine up until the time he was a young adult, but that was around the time that his mother died.
By then, he had learned enough about music and how to take care of himself, so he packed up and left home as a struggling musician. He knew he had what it took to be a great musician. He just didn't know what to do with it.
He once said something about the road to greatness being no picnic whatsoever. He banged around Florida for quite a while, both as a solo act and as a member in bands at the time.
Very early, Ray knew that he chose a very tough career.
He starved a lot back then. When he could find one, he'd hang out at a musicians' union hall for as long as he could. Back then, the musicians' union was more than just a paper card. I mean, they actually tried to help you get work.
He picked up gigs where he could along the way, but there were months when he didn't have anything or any people even to play with. It's about that time that he realized he needed to make himself into a permanent solo act because he really just simply couldn't count on other people.
He loved the idea of being a lone wolf. He had an idol back then, a guy who basically worked by himself, Nat King Cole.
Some say that he hated Florida back then. It represented everything that was difficult and hard in his career.
The story goes that he asked a friend once what was the furthest place he could be from Florida, but still be in the continental United States. He ended up in Seattle, Washington, where he knew nothing about the people, the culture, or much else for that matter.
Whatever Seattle was, it wasn't the Deep South. I mean, it was an enlightened society.
He was talented, it was a very hip place, and so it wasn't very long before he became a local celebrity.
Seattle turned out to be a good place for Ray Charles at that time in history.
Well, there are other musicians there as well, and I believe he knew that before he just picked Seattle out of a hat.
One of the first musicians he met when he started to play in Seattle was a guy named Quincy Jones.
This marked the start of their 2 lives together in music, 2 lives that went on to accomplish some pretty big things.
Ray was older than Quincy and more experienced in live performance. He kind of took Quincy under his wing.
They went years sometimes without their lives crossing paths, but sometimes they did, and sometimes even working together. After a while, Ray thought he should cut a record, so here he was on the West Coast, so where else but Los Angeles to go do it?
It was possible for Ray to record an album in Seattle at that time, but he wanted to try Hollywood. He made his first professional recording in LA, and about all he got out of it was a trip to LA.
Even though the record really didn't go anywhere, he knew that Los Angeles was a place that he wanted to return to someday. He went back to Seattle to play a few more clubs, and you know what? He met some other local musicians at that time.
Gossity McGee was a guy very much like Ray Charles. He could play an instrument, sing a tune, and hold a stage. They hit it off, and pretty soon they added another guy and created an act.
McGee and Ray Charles formed something that they called the McSun Trio. The name came from McSun. It came from the Mick in McGee and the Son in Robinson, because his name was still Robinson at the time.
That was McSun, as in the McSun Trio. And with TV just beginning, they actually got a weekly gig singing on TV.
It was 1948. TV was still a test pattern, and they were the first black group to have a sponsored television show in the Northwest. As primitive as television was, this was quite groundbreaking. I mean, probably more groundbreaking than they even realized.
Now that he was finding steady work, playing day and night, Ray Charles quickly expanded as an artist.
After McGee and the TV show, he teamed up with Lowell Fulsom's band, and that was a pretty big gig in those days. They played together for a while back then, but he started to learn quite quickly that he was much more of a leader than a follower.
Ray Charles formed another group, but this time he made sure that he was the core member of it. Ruth Brown was a hot singer, and boy, she really cooked with that band.
In those days, you weren't anything until you played New York. So, Ray and Ruth and the band, they all headed east.
It didn't take long for him to play the Apollo Theater, and like so many other acts of the time, the Apollo really worked to make people stars.
They played around in New York, and soon New York realized what Seattle had. This Ray Charles was some good stuff.
Playing the Apollo Theater was a dream come true for him.
He wanted to break barriers by playing in places like Carnegie Hall, and he did after he started recording again.
He wanted to play Carnegie Hall. That was not a dream that every African-American artist let themselves have.
His sound was getting bigger, his band was getting bigger, and pretty soon he put together a live band that could also record well, too.
Ray's band put out a new album with a single on it called I've Got a Woman. I Got a Woman was a big success, and it was the single that started it all for Ray Charles.
By the early 60s, the albums kept coming and the singles kept coming off the albums, and Ray Charles was here and he was good.
He knew what he was capable of, and he, at that time, was really feeling what audiences wanted from him.
He came of age musically as the decade was starting, and he also was a good showman. I mean, he really had it all together at this time.
By the time he arrived on the scene, he was a great musician already. He could play the piano with no effort at all.
He knew he was where he wanted to be when he played that first concert at Carnegie Hall. Playing Carnegie Hall was the first of many dreams that would come true for Ray Charles.
He had a song that would become one of those absolutely legendary songs. Georgia was, and it still is, one of these songs that has classic written all over it.
Even though that song's been done by so many people, it's been covered by everybody, but you hear Ray Charles do it and it sounds effortless.
He kept climbing the charts. I mean, not just here, all over the world.
Born to Lose was another hit single that cemented his reputation as a hit maker.
He was soon ready to take his act abroad, not just because he wanted to, because he was in high demand.
He toured Europe in 1960 and it absolutely changed his life. Here he was, this poor little man from Georgia, from the South, touring Europe. It was a great thing in those days.
He has a huge worldwide following, and that was set in motion when he did his first European tour back in 1960.
He quickly grew to love Europe, and he still tours there just about every year.
In 1961, he came back to America and put together even a bigger band than he had before.
By '62, he was working with a guy who was a longtime friend, and he also became his manager. His name was Joe Adams. I guess Adams worked the business and Ray worked the music, and it was a combination that seemed to make sense.
Ray Charles and Joe Adams built a recording studio in the 60s, but this was just the beginning. This was the era when Ray Charles made huge albums, bigger than anything that had happened before.
His new music was sort of developing a new flavor. It was blues and pop. Before long, I mean, he was really experimenting. He wanted to try new things, find new sounds, very innovative.
He put out a country album of all things, which really isn't such a shock when you finally listen to I Can't Stop Loving You.
Modern sounds in country and western went beyond I Can't Stop Loving You. It had a full-blown Grand Ole Opry sound.
Genius plus soul equals jazz was a risky album, but he really had to do it.
He's recorded many rhythm and blues tracks. The real surprise is how often he can reinvent the form.
People don't always connect him with rock, but he is connected. People like Dylan, the Stones, they all borrow from his stuff. He was part of the birth of rock and roll. I mean, if anything, he made it possible for an older generation to actually understand rock.
Just when rock and roll was hitting in the mid-60s, a great big profile was written about him.
The piece circulated around the music industry because at that time, he was a major force.
You can't pigeonhole his sound. They couldn't do it in the 60s, and you can't do it today.
The article really hit it on the head when it was going into about how you really can't categorize Ray Charles. There is no category for him.
As rock and roll was finally finding its way, he was the absolute best blues singer on the charts.
Pretty soon, there started to be a lot written about Ray Charles by a lot of different writers.
Music critics, after a while, couldn't find anything to criticize. He would sing whatever he wanted to sing, and it would always come out sounding great.
He was on a lot of music shows back then. As a matter of fact, he was on almost all of them because when Ray Charles was on, he made them look good. People saw then what we all know today. He was the master of his soul then and now.
You don't see him jump on any sort of bandwagon. He just does what he does. To this day, he still selects his recorded material with no regard to trend.
In these later years, he doesn't seem to find the time to write as much as he once did.
A few years ago, he set out to record a lot of different things that he'd always wanted to try. In the past decade, he's done some recordings of Gershwin. He figured he better do it while he still can.
He made a really great album of the music from Porgy and Bess, and that album really brings together two great American treasures when you think about it.
He really liked the songs of Rodgers and Hammerstein, and he even took those into the studio. His version of Some Enchanted Evening is not unexpected because of its selection, but rather because of his style.
While he was having this love affair with the American musical, he also recorded some songs from Oklahoma. Oh, What a Beautiful Morning was an easy listening hit that sort of showed you that he could record the most unorthodox material.
Nobody should be surprised about a man who could make America the Beautiful into a hit.
The strangest part of his success is that there's been a lot written about him, but he's still an enigma.
He's polite, but people always say that he's firm as well. I mean, in a recording session, he's the boss, and everybody knows it.
He's still quite private. He keeps the press away from a lot of aspects of his life.
He does speak his mind publicly, but he's very, very selective about what he says and how he says it and who he's saying it about.
But yet, he's one of those amazing individuals who just never seems to be bitter about life.
Ray said it was sort of ironic. His lack of sight kind of helped him with the whole racial issue.
On the early days of segregation, he's spoken out a lot. He's had quite a bit to say about it.
There was an essay written about him that said he never saw the skin of a person.
Without his sight, he had the opportunity to listen to people, but not know what they look like.
Ray Charles learned a long time ago he can't get distracted by a person's color. It's something he can't see.
He's often said that when he looks at somebody, he looks inside them.
It's not that he's immune to racism. He grew up in the South, and he has the stories to prove it.
On the road in the 50s, he was sued for a gig that he didn't play. He didn't play that job because that was supposed to be a segregated situation. Blacks up in the balcony and whites down on the floor.
He said he thought black people should sit down where he was because he said he wouldn't play if they wouldn't do it. Well, he was sued and he lost, but he was broke, so he didn't have to really give anything.
From that point on, he became really interested in something that he couldn't see, and that was race.
In the 1960s, he became very close friends with Martin Luther King.
He got involved with a cause when the movement started taking hold.
Civil rights was a dangerous game back then, and it's no good being blind in a street brawl.
He wanted to march with Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther King told him, no, you can't, because You have to be able to see when to duck.
Ray Charles realized he could get involved. When King broke laws, he could get arrested.
Martin Luther King and his workers needed money for bail on almost a daily basis. Ray had an idea of how he'd help King with this problem. He would play concerts and raise money for the whole cause.
I'm sure that Ray Charles posted bail more times for Dr. Martin Luther King than he could possibly remember.
He knew about the problems in South Africa long before it was hip to sing about Sun City.
Actually, he's very modest about his humanitarian activities, and they're not very well publicized.
He fought apartheid when he got others sort of clued in to what was really going on there.
He became interested in the Middle East back when the first Palestinian and Israeli conflicts flared up.
He's become a big supporter of Israel, and he's played concerts over there many, many times.
He's become a real spokesman for the Israeli cause, and he's not afraid to make that clear.
He was good friends with many Israeli leaders. Some of them have been assassinated, which isn't that rare over there.
He's walked into a lot of dangerous situations when he's gone over to the Mideast, but he insists on helping the people of Israel.
B'nai B'rith is an organization from Beverly Hills that knows just how generous Ray Charles can be when it comes to organizations like that.
He gave a speech once where he said that blacks and Jews have a common history of persecution.
B'nai B'rith has honored Ray Charles with the highest award that they have.
They made him Man of the Year in 1976, and Ray Charles said that was probably the height of his career.
Of course, he helps many, many causes with his music. He's probably played more benefits than anybody will ever know. So here it is, so many years in the business, but Ray Charles just keeps rolling along.
He's at a place now where younger people want to know as much as they can about his music. Singers fight to record with him. He was a guest of honor on We Are the World, and the Blues Brothers loved working with him.
He really is music. I mean, when you look at the history of recorded American music, he is music.
He's one of those rare individuals that seems to be just totally comfortable with who he is.
He's quintessential American music. I mean, Ray Charles couldn't have come from any other place on the planet. He's a hometown product.
You know, you can only play like that if you have it together, all of it together.
He's the master of his soul, and you can hear that when you listen to his music.
When you hear "Take These Chains from My Heart," you're hearing history.
This guy can do a Pepsi ad and make it look cool. I mean, not everybody can do that.
Crying Time. That's one of the greatest recordings of all time, and that's one of his.
Even You Are My Sunshine. How do you take You Are My Sunshine and not only make it relevant, you make it a hit? Listen to greats like Joe Cocker, Steve Winwood, Van Morrison. They all got so much from Ray Charles.
He's already withstood everything, and if God forbid he's ever gone, we'll still be playing Ray Charles, no doubt about it. To some people, he's the sun, the moon, the earth, the stars. He's everything. That's what Ray Charles is to his fans, everything.